Next is Leong Leong, Dominic and Christopher Leong. What impresses me about the work of Leong Leong is their desire for wholeness. My sense is that they design from the inside out. Partly this may stem from their early work, using their design installations as a way of prototyping their ideas. But now, in their larger scale work, there is the search for coherence between what appears on the outside and how it is experienced from the inside. And although their work can be seductive, it is as well driven by deeper values of connectivity and community, beauty and heart.
Thank you, Billy, for that introduction. Actually, when I first came to New York in 2000, the first office I went to was Todd Williams and Billy Ten's office, and didn't have any jobs at the time, but they were gracious enough to give me a tour, and or someone from their office was able to give me a tour, and that meant a lot to me. So I'd always thought about that. It's really a great honor to be here and be introduced by Billy Ten. We also want to thank Anna Rieselbach and Rosalie Ginevra from the League, who've just been amazing supporters of architecture and part of the reason that we're here in this community in New York City. Also want to thank Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown, who are sort of supporting so many aspects of architecture here in New York. And also to our current staff and past collaborators who we wouldn't be here without. And we're really fortunate to have worked with some really amazing people, and many of them are here today.
Yeah, this is a unique opportunity for us. Obviously, thinking about what our voices, and seeing a lot of colleagues in the room, and how lucky we are to practice in New York and really be a New York practice, and the conversations we've had and the other firms' work that we are constantly looking at and inspired by, and also kind of generating a discourse relative to sometimes. So I'm going to read a manifesto. It was something I actually wrote in response to the AIA's sort of lack of response to our new president. But it was really a kind of really important, as for a lot of people, moment to reassess our values and what we do to create meaning, in our case, architecture. So now more than ever, we need to be cosmopolitans. We have experienced the tribalization of our political sphere through the echo chamber of social media. Our need to belong has been satisfied by our incessant connectivity and algorithms which continually redirect us into a self-referential vortex. The parochializing effects of our network culture were hard to foresee precisely because we may have oriented ourselves to a false horizon. As we try to overcome this nauseating reality, our cities and institutions are critical spaces for exchange and self-reflection. The possibility of encountering other people, other values, and other needs is vital to our cities and therefore architecture. In the face of this political, possibly existential crisis, which seems to turn us towards the past, we should dig deep into our expertise of social innovation to formulate new typologies of collectivity, new spaces of exchange, new realities to create a neo-cosmopolitan architecture that responds not only to our political, cultural crisis potentially that this puts into the foreground, but also an ecological one. One of architecture's greatest powers is to render aesthetic experiences that precede language, rhetoric, and rationality. By offering aesthetic modalities and organizational possibilities, architecture becomes a tool of self-actualization that nudges us towards new ways of relating to ourselves and each other. As we construct architecture, it in turn constructs us. So in a lot of ways, I see a lot of actually themes relative to Duval Decker's work, and it's interesting to be in New York, but also see a similar spirit happening in another context. So it was actually a kind of interesting process to put this lecture together, because we realized that being brothers, Dominic and Chris, that there's actually not only two voices, but actually three voices, ours individually, but also the office as a whole. And for us, we're we're brothers. Architecture is a very biographical experience for us. Our father was an architect. This was one of our first projects, which was a fort on the site of our childhood home, which was designed and built by our father. So this idea of architecture from the inside out is really, I think, accurate in terms of the way we go about what we do and how we form our practice. But we're also, this is us in couples therapy. Probably a lot of, maybe partners can also relate to the need for this. But in a way, for us to practice together is also a lot about learning about our relationship as brothers. But we're also constantly trying to escape that biographical reading of our practice or our work. So we really consider this triad of voices a part of a larger multiplicity or a collective of other collaborators. And this is our office. And not showing everybody, it is all males, but there are women that work with us. But so we're obviously here in New York, and we share an office on Bowery. And so you have the two of us and then our current staff. And we're also within a larger kind of collective organization that includes two amazing graphic designers, Projects and MTWTF, who we oftentimes collaborate with. So we really are kind of, trying to move beyond this kind of sibling dynamic and actually participate in a larger collective way of thinking about what we do. And being in New York is really much a part of that. And we feel really fortunate to practice here, because what it means is that we're very much based within this culture of New York, but also connected to the kind of global context. We started off our practice working on a project in Seoul for a fashion client named Philip Lim. And at the same time, we were working out of a townhouse in Chelsea, which we were designing and renovating. So from the very beginning, there's been this duality of a very local mindset and also a very global mindset. And so while we were kind of doing these projects in other parts of the world, we're also using New York and the Lower East Side to experiment and build installations and galleries. And in the middle, you can see an installation we did for the Architectural League, or Creative Time and other cultural institutions. And so even though we started out in this kind of commercial realm, we were really trying to diversify and actually start to develop conversations with other cultural institutions in New York. And so this idea of being in this global flow is also a larger context, kind of technological, social context, which we see as a really defining factor in terms of understanding what the value of architecture is in general. And this is a diagram that essentially charts these multiple speeds, this idea of tempo that we practice, and the idea that time is much a determining factor of what we do as the kind of physical, political, social constraints that we have to react to. So this kind of exponential curve of Moore's law, increasing computing power, kind of along with network culture, creates this kind of acceleration of constant change. And then you have Darwin or human evolution, which is obviously an extremely slow process, and this sort of disconnect that we increasingly experience between hypercomplexity and, in a way, our kind of neurological capacity to process that. And we see architecture somewhere in between. It's not quite as fast as technology. And so we kind of wonder, are we really about trying to keep pace with this acceleration of constant change, or does architecture, being inherently slow, offer some kind of resistance and antidote to what we call this term VUCA, which is actually borrowed from entrepreneurial culture and now definitely appropriated by political culture. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so, in a way, this kind of larger context starts to inform certain kind of disciplinary themes within our work that we're sort of working through as we speak. But the idea of collectivity, aesthetics, and legibility, and how these issues start to inform new typologies. And I think three kind of general provocations relative to these themes that are sort of at play in the work in obvious or less obvious ways. One, collectivity and organization. If the space of the city is no longer the primary medium of social organization that it once was, what role does architecture play in contributing and forming collective experiences? So the other one is aesthetics and the social. I think we're interested in architecture as a social practice as much as an aesthetic practice, and trying to look at the relationship between the two rather than them being in opposing camps. So if architecture is an aesthetic practice, and aesthetics are about creating sensible experiences that in a way question our world but also help us make sense of it, what exactly are we making sensible? Is it the new aesthetic of network culture, or are we trying to look for an aesthetic anecdote to this kind of hyper-complexity? So what new aesthetics experiences are we creating that allow us to understand ourselves and how we interact with one another? Complexity and legibility. If we exist in a constantly accelerating culture of complexity, how does architecture not only embrace this complexity, but also kind of work as an antidote to this overwhelming kind of nature by offering moments of legibility? So then this kind of leads us into how do we make these issues architectural? And for a long time, we've been fascinated with these kind of Gestalt diagrams because they start to nudge these questions into architectural issues. And for a lot of reasons, they can be read in terms of creating an experience or perception. They can also be read in terms of organization. They can also start to generate a formal language. And the idea that it also kind of addresses this issue of the individual to collective, the kind of coexistence of figures and fields and the ambiguity that flips back and forth between the reading of this diagram.
So the next couple of projects we're going to show are sort of this experiments in formatting collectivity. The first is a project called White Zinfandel, which was a publication which we did with another graphic designer with projects that we were collaborating with at the time. And the genesis of this project was part in being in New York City and being surrounded by so many creative fields, artists, writers, designers, architects, and wanting to create a situation to bring these people together, some of whom we knew, some of whom we didn't know. And we're both really interested in food and really interested in the idea of the table as a format. So White Zinfandel kind of started and was inspired also by Gordon Matta Clark, who in the 1970s created a restaurant, sort of a short-lived restaurant called Food that was in Soho. That was both about sort of nourishing his sort of, or not just Gordon Matta Clark, but him and his partners, about creating sort of a nourishment for sort of a collective of artists in the Soho, but also in itself a sort of a concept of bringing people together. So the format that we developed was to base each publication on a menu, and each menu item would be sent to different contributors who would then send something back in a sort of stream of consciousness format or any sort of format that related to their work, and it would be all kind of come back in a way that we could never really predict, and then consolidate into a singular publication. So this is a photographer, Pete Divical, whose menu was honey and yams. And Bauke, who's a graphic designer, who said not to forget Tina and Caroline, who also were partners in food. And the culmination of these publications were a dinner in which there was a menu, a chef composed that menu, and all these people got to come together and sort of see what the others had produced and what they, and spend a little bit of time together. And then this is sort of the second dinner that was in a gallery with in which the plates themselves were part of the production. The next project, Office US, is a sort of another idea about a table in a sense, and a surface and a place for gathering and a format for bringing people together in a collaborative form. And that's Office US, which was the exhibition for the American Pavilion at the 2014 Venice Biennale, which was curated by Rem, and his brief was sort of twofold. One was fundamentals in architecture, but also the dissemination of modernism and how that translated into national architectures of the last 100 years. And so with the curatorial team led by Storefront for Art in Architecture, Eva Frank, the director, Anna Miliaki from MIT, and Ashley Schaefer from Praxis, we devised an exhibition and a program which was looking at the American corporate office and the export of American architecture over the past 100 years. And in itself, the project was really interesting for us because it was really about a network. There was well over 100 people, 100 groups, individuals involved in the project ultimately over 5 months that it existed at the Venice Biennale. And this was the production team that involved, researchers, design team, graphic designers, fashion designers, sort of every component that you could imagine in almost a sort of utopian way. If you were to design an office that would exist only for 5 months, this is the team that went together. And so for us, this idea of thinking about what the fundamental platform might be for an architecture office, after we're looking at and studying sort of, the history of architecture offices, was really this idea of the table or the work surface. And again, these are sort of the American corporate office, SOM, again, lots of white males sitting around a table, but really thinking about this idea of the table as a format, both as a sort of space of production, but also a place of exhibition. So the idea of exhibiting work in the Venice Biennale, how do you exhibit work culture when someone's actually working in the space? It's a bit of a theater, but it's also sort of an interesting question about how design can sort of serve to exhibit what's sort of happening. And so we really looked at the idea of a vitrine as a table and how it could be at once transparent and revealing the tools and the objects that were produced over the course of the Biennale, but also to be opaque and singular from different vantage points. And so this is a view of one of the partners. There were 7 partners who worked at the Biennale for the course of 5 months, and this is sort of a collapse of the table as a toolbox, and also in the backdrop the archive, which showed the exports of American architecture, and so the workers sort of sitting between the archive and the table itself. So we covered the pavilion with mirror blinds, and developed a sort of a singular table that cut through the kind of Neo-Palladian plan that gave a sort of continuity and an organizing element throughout the entire series of rooms, but essentially was organized as an office would be, with the reception, with the workspace, with the bedroom as is needed in work culture now, and a kitchen where most of the activity actually happened, the conversations, presentations, and whatnot. And so it was really this idea of the history sort of being on this vertical surface and the idea of making being on this horizontal surface, and the two coming together. And then ultimately the conference room, which had an exterior table that was sort of a gathering point over different moments in the pavilion.
So the next project we call Soft Brutalism. Brutalism seems to be interesting for some reason. This was actually a fashion pop-up store, and it was part of the BOFO fashion series where they're pairing young architects with young fashion designers, and a really great program in which they're giving these young architects an opportunity to build a temporary pop-up store. And we were paired with a New York fashion designer, a menswear designer named CKM, and we were really compelled by his ability to create narratives out of his shows. And so we went to his show. It was in a parking garage, And what he was really exploring in the show was the idea of xenophobia and an encounter. So he really flipped the format of the runway in this parking garage. And so what you see is essentially a row of models, and then there was a line in the ground, and the audience had to stand behind the line. And then as the show progressed, the line moved closer and closer to the models. So it kind of really heightened this encounter with the closing and really objectified the kind of the line of models. And so we're really curious how we could translate this experience into a new kind of retail concept for this pop-up store. And so the idea that if we could somehow delay the encounter with the clothes or these kind of fetishized objects, that we could actually heighten the encounter with other people. And so the whole project kind of operated on this level of obscuring the existing kind of shipping container that we were given as a constraint, and kind of setting up this procession of delay and encounter. And I think in a lot of our work, we are looking for this kind of very clear organizational device, or this figure which can efficiently sort of reconfigure in a kind of existing envelope. And so in this case, the idea of this ramp form became really compelling because it offered a sort of central space and then these sort of tertiary spaces underneath. And so if we just kind of drop this figure into this space, it automatically transforms the kind of experience and the organization of the space, and creates an opportunity for people to enter, and also for the clothes to be actually hidden or embedded underneath the ramp form. So you kind of slowly approach, you notice this ramp. It's this really weird texture, which is actually soy-based spray foam. You enter into the into the store, and you see maybe no one, but this is also the POS system, the point of sale. And you may encounter other people who are also not really sure what to expect. So it's a kind of this intentionally awkward experience in which to kind of heighten this interaction between people. And this kind of reading of the work is, kind of reappropriating common materials. I think what's interesting for us about that is essentially this kind of fine line between familiarity and foreignness, and how we are not totally about a completely new aesthetic. We're more interested in shifting a kind of existing aesthetic into a slightly new territory. So it's not completely alienating, but it nudges you into a different kind of experience. You had to take your shoes off, and then finally you would see the clothes underneath this ramp. And there's these kind of weird, strange domestic, alien domestic moments. And then the idea that from as you walk around the space, the clothes are kind of displayed in the vitrines. And just a section showing that relationship. And also the idea of ambiguity and how it's totally open-ended in terms of the way it can be used or interpreted. So this starts to speak about, we're sort of moving up in scale and starting to get re-engaged with the city, and also looking at the work more in terms of typological transformations. This is a project in Miami Design District, which we were commissioned to essentially reskin a parking structure. And what's fascinating about the parking structure in Miami is essentially it's gone from a service infrastructure to a spectacle within the city. And the design district is actually a fascinating phenomena, using almost design skins to change the character of a neighborhood. And at the same time offering a lot of amazing opportunities for architects to experiment. So we feel kind of fortunate to be asked to do that. And I think the question here was really, how do we respond to multiple scales? The site itself is located just off the highway on your way from the airport to Miami Beach. And so in a way, it's really a marker for the design district. And, sort of inspired by these qualities of Miami, water, palm trees, but kind of abstracting that and looking at water as a phenomena that is kind of ever-changing, but also has these kind of interesting, almost like geometric kind of effects to it. And if we were to sort of abstract that kind of dynamic pattern into actually these very clear shapes, we could start to kind of have a certain efficiency in terms of generating a kind of visual effect. And working within a really tight budget, it was really about this simple move of taking a sheet of stainless steel, cutting holes in it, and then basically bending the tab to create this overall effect. So the idea that from this scale of the car in the highway, it would sort of produce this shimmering effect, and as you approach it at closer and closer to the pedestrian scale, would start to reveal itself more as a kind of texture, familiar in one sense, maybe to the palm trees that surround it, and actually taking on almost like this really rough, almost like exfoliating kind of effect. And then down to these very clear, like simple shapes.
So moving up in the scale of the city, this is a project, the Center for Community and Entrepreneurship, which again is also a little bit about the idea of the evolving typology, and in this case, the typology of the mixed-use office building. The client or the owner of the building is Asian Americans for Equality, who started off as an advocacy group in the 70s, fighting for Asian Americans to be involved in affordable housing project that was being built in Chinatown. And that group has since evolved into being the largest developer of affordable housing in Lower Manhattan and providing social services, financial services, support services to Asian American community and other communities throughout the city. And the context is Flushing, Queens, which is a really, for us, fascinating context. One is that it's the second most dense street life, second to Times Square in all the city. So at any hour of the day that you're there, there's a tremendous amount of activity and just vibrancy that's happening at the street level. But also the fact that it's has a public level that is actually multi-levels. So rather than sort of one layer of a kind of storefront, you can either go below grade or sometimes 2 or 3 levels above grade to find a market on the 3rd floor. That it's a very sort of vertical urbanism. And this is sort of a newer development in Flushing, which is sort of a banal image, but this idea that this is a shopping center that really has a below grade, above grade, and an at grade. It also has living, it also has working. It's sort of, there's an embrace of these hybrid typologies, I think, in Flushing that makes it a very interesting and dynamic kind of urban context. This is another very typical context in Flushing in which the street front is really 2 street fronts because there's a split level of going up and going down, which is not something you typically see throughout the rest of the city. And it's also sort of a destination for the Asian American community, immigrant communities throughout the entire East Coast. I mean, this is a job listings board, bulletin board, and one of many throughout Flushing and all the other parts of Chinatown, where people will come to look for jobs all throughout the East Coast, transportation, housing, things like that. So it's a physical Craigslist, if you will, and so it's a really interesting and context for us to be working in, and it's our first ground-up building here in the city. This is the site. It's on the outskirts of downtown Flushing, looking towards Manhattan, looking towards Willets Point and Shea Stadium. And it's a really small site comparatively to other sites, but it's sort of a hinge site. And it's only 14,000 square feet, but it's the end of 39th Avenue, which is a very pedestrian-oriented street. Main Street is the main street in Flushing. And so what you see right now in Flushing is a lot of development, and sort of part of this idea of this kind of global flow of capital. A lot of the development, all the money for the development is coming from not just New York City, but from abroad, and a lot of from China, in the same way that it's happening in sort of luxury housing in a lot of parts of New York City. So there's a tremendous amount of development, and the plan is for Flushing to develop further to the west. And there's a lot of work in terms of the rezoning that's sort of happening and not happening at the same time. But we're really interested in addressing both those contexts and how this building as a sort of a hinge would relate to the new context. And how the new development, and this is a city planning diagram, would sort of extend these view corridors down to Flushing Creek, and eventually, when Flushing Creek can get, remediated, that it could actually become a kind of a waterfront for a very kind of non-waterfront oriented part of the city for a while. And so our site is really about trying to extend that continuity from downtown and create a sort of a public space, a sort of a front door, which there aren't a lot of in Flushing, and have a building that really has something that brings the community in. Because part of what is interesting about this project and this developer, this nonprofit developer, is that a lot of the success of the development of Flushing is actually driving up rent and actually making it very difficult for small businesses in Flushing to actually get a foothold. So the idea of creating a community center that's sort of an entrepreneurial center, so providing support for businesses at a very small scale, whether you're an individual that needs a space, this is a sort of a building that is that is meant to provide that support and service. And it's also sort of like these sort of hybrid typologies, a conglomeration of many different programs, sort of a community marketplace, community event space, a local serving co-working space, and then commercial office space. So there's this sort of, all the elements of AFI's mission are sort of embodied in this building. So it's a really kind of, the idea of interlocking these multiple programs into a singular urban form is sort of what the sort of the main idea is. There's parking requirements in Flushing, but really, it's really a sort of a stacking and interlocking of these multiple programs to create a sort of singular form, but also giving back and recessing some of these facades to create outdoor space. So what you wouldn't find in a typical mixed-use office building would be outdoor space, but the idea that this is a public-facing building, that public space and outdoor space is part of it, to sort of see and be seen was really important. And we also wanted to play in the form of the building with sort of the lot line and sort of see the building almost as a set piece and pull out the lot line, but then pull it back. So the building that sort of follows will sort of be in conversation with it. And this is the building, sort of College Point is a very urban thoroughfare. And then 39th Avenue, which is sort of the front of the building, is where is sort of this front door. And because it's a very vertical stacked program, the idea of how do you open up and how do you bring a public up into the second and third floor became very important. So there's almost sort of a front porch, sort of outdoor, sort of terrace, and then sort of vertical circulation that doubles as gathering space and sort of a stadium seating, but that pulls you up to the third floor. So it's both a sort of place of encounter, place of informal connection, where the incubator space and the co-working space can really filter down into the community event space, where the activities, the events that are happening at the center would be visible from the street, and vice versa. These are sort of the plans. And at night, this idea that the building is, for a non-for-profit to develop a building with this much curtain wall isn't very traditional, but because it's a little bit expensive, but it's also the importance of making the activities very, very visible to the street. So the building itself is sort of a beacon in all throughout the day.
Okay, so this is the last project, and this is a commission that we won. It was a competition in Los Angeles for the Los Angeles LGBT Center's new campus. And we thought we were actually the only architect outside of LA to be a part of it. And obviously probably the smallest, youngest firm. But and we really didn't think we'd have any chance of winning this, but we thought it was important, an important project regardless, because of what we thought it signified and the potential for architecture to give a voice to a collective that, for the most part, hasn't been expressed through architecture on a kind of civic level. And so a little bit about the organization. It's the largest LGBT organization in the country and possibly the world, offering social services to the LGBT community. And in a way, this kind of movement that started in the Stonewall riots in 1969, this organization really falls within the legacy of social progress. So in the U.S., there's over 640,000 homeless LGBT youth. In L.A. and Hollywood, it's actually almost a mecca of sorts for the homeless. And currently, the center has existing facilities scattered throughout Hollywood, which include senior housing, social services, a youth center, which is essentially a shelter, and a health clinic, and a cultural center, which is called the Village. And it really kind of brought up issues for us of what can architecture do in this case, and the idea that we went around and visited some existing facilities. We went to the Harvey Milk School here in New York, and what was fascinating was that this school literally tried to change the format of a school precisely because a lot of the individuals who were coming here were essentially escaping these conventional schools where there's so much trauma associated with them. So the idea that some kind of aesthetic experience was really important in terms of opening up new possibilities. And at the same time, what is really driving these existing LGBT centers are it's all happening within existing buildings, and security is actually a huge driving factor. And at one point, what we learned at the Harvey Milk School was that the entrance was actually really trying to be obscure, and the idea that the discreteness of the entrance was really important because it was allowed for privacy and in terms of how you entered the building. So we thought that was kind of fascinating, and we really kind of thought of this project as a hierarchy of needs, and the idea that architecture with a capital A typically inhabits the pinnacle of this pyramid, this kind of moment of self-actualization that society self-actualizes through the creation of architecture and expresses its values. But a lot of what was driving these existing typologies were really these basic needs, which were basic survival, biological needs of just getting food and things like that, having a sense of security. And somehow the idea of that hierarchy getting redistributed as a network, and that architecture could somehow encompass all of those needs, not just exist at this kind of pinnacle of culture, so to speak. So the program itself is actually really complex. It includes a youth shelter, a youth academy, a kind of continuum of living. So the shelter becomes a dormitory, which then also becomes a transitional living program, which are essentially studios. And you also have a career center. You have a senior center, 100 units of senior housing. You have an existing cultural space across the street in the Village. And you have, we actually introduced a huge, well, not a huge, but like relatively large program which was a cultural event space, which we saw as really important in terms of creating a campus that kind of also was celebratory as much as it was a sanctuary, and admin offices. So then when, oftentimes we're trying to relate these sort of larger cultural, social issues to architectural issues or disciplinary issues. And for a while, we've been interested in the Matt building, looking at Le Corbusier's Venice Hospital as an interesting example of this horizontal, non-hierarchical organizational system, which is actually very porous and permeable in the way that it connects into the existing urban fabric, but also kind of allows for a lot of moments of entry into it, which we thought was interesting. Or the Berlin Free Matt building, which is radically different in terms of how it relates to context, because it's sort of in a green kind of non-urban environment. But we were compelled by this sort of the green space that could sort of permeate into this matrix of space. And at the same time, we're also critical of this typology for a lot of common reasons, like wayfinding. We also felt like it didn't have a strong sense of identity, and it was very nondescript in that sense. But we thought that this particular typological correction that you see in this photo, which is Norman Foster's library that's inserted into this horizontal organization, actually provides a moment of like figuration or identity or iconicity, which is actually a key component, I think, within the LGBT campus, is that there's a kind of coexistence of multiplicity, but also kind of singularness at the same time. And then looking really also at the history of the Courtyard House as a kind of fundamental living style within LA or within Hollywood. And so we started to explore this language where you have this inversion of figure field, solid void, indoor, outdoor, moments of like extreme opacity, which maintain kind of privacy, but also moments of transparency where you can actually see into the building. And we were exploring this kind of language and how we could use these courtyards to also kind of separate these diverse programs, but also connect them. And the utopian vision of the program, which is really kind of transgenerational and extremely, diverse, is that all of these users actually don't always want to mix. So we want to have this kind of, coexistence, but also the necessary separations between kids coming off the street who just need to like chill out and relax, and then seniors who are, want to garden or something like that. So we were exploring how these courtyards actually generate their own atmosphere through landscaping, and that starts to permeate the interior space, and still maintain these kind of open plan, which, through the course of the design, the openness became a really challenging thing to maintain. Because of all of these kind of separation requirements. So the site itself is on Santa Monica and McAdam. Highland is over here, if you're familiar with LA. And it's a 70,000 square foot site, which is actually part of Obama designated promise zone. And across the street is the existing village of Ed Gould, which has a gallery and a theater. And right down here is Michael Molson's Regen projects. So I also have to mention that the client was actually two. There was a partnership between the Los Angeles LGBT Center and low-income housing developer named Thomas Saffron. And I need to add also that we're working on this project with a local executive named Christopher Fleming. So it was very collaborative. But back to so essentially what we really wanted to avoid was the idea that the kind of common collective outdoor space would be kind of fortified and isolated from the city, and move more towards this, kind of typological correction of the mat building, which was really about permeability and a kind of syncopation of different scales from the domestic to the institutional. And this is what typically happens in Los Angeles. The podium parking more or less isolates the building from the ground plane of the city. And we were really concerned with enhancing that connectivity. So, probably the biggest move in the project was actually to submerge the parking, which is, very unconventional. This is the plan, which is actually quite complex. It's almost a city within a city. So you have the youth center, the drop-in shelter, the dormitories, the transitional living program across the street, senior center, 100 units of senior housing, the cultural flex space that we introduced that connects to the courtyard of the village across the street, trying to create a sort of public plaza that goes across the street. We actually tried to close the street at one point, but didn't make it through planning. And then the existing cultural center, which is the theater and the gallery. And putting a coffee shop in there, which really this project is also about serving and activating as a catalyst for the surrounding neighborhood. And then the admin facilities that essentially run the whole program. So the idea that you have these multiple entry points, there's actually 6 entries to the building. this kind of public space that we linked to the existing courtyard or building across the street. And then the idea that there's almost these three figures, these three identities that become this part of this urban gesture. And the overall form is essentially a sort of mosaic of these programmatic shapes, which create this sort of porous urban form that sort of nests within the existing fabric of the city. So this model shot sort of describes the continuity on the ground floor of the program, but then these larger programs that sit on top, which start to create a kind of urban gesture. On the corner of Santa Monica, the open plaza that connects to the senior center on the left, and then this flex space on the right, which had this large kind of urban projection screen. And then on top of this flex space, we introduced a kind of urban observatory, which was really, this whole flex space was really about this, these kind of moments of celebration that acted as an interface between the LGBT community and the city at large. And then each kind of point of entry was a really deep penetration into the floor plan in order to create these outdoor spaces that were really about creating sanctuaries, because oftentimes, the kids living on the street don't really have safe outdoor spaces. So we're really concerned with creating these kind of sanctuary courtyards. And then just looking down the street, sort of reinforcing this idea of like this sort of domestic scale, and then these kind of institutional, almost monumental volumes that rest on top of it. So it sort of oscillates between kind of domestic environment and an institutional one. And then the idea that the ground floor, which actually has to sort of be opaque and transparent, but the volumes above could be these sort of like glowing lanterns in a way. And just a view looking at, on the right, the entry into the youth center and the flex space on the left, and you can see how the building kind of opens up and closes off as it needs to. And this is just an image of the flex space opening up onto the plaza, and the kind of penetration that you can see through into the courtyards beyond, and across the street, the Transnational Living Program. And the reality of building housing in Los Angeles is very needed, but also very challenging in terms of what can be accomplished within the constraints of this construction type. So we fought hard just to get this kind of alternating pattern of balconies. The units are all stacking, but the balconies are alternating. And the curve, like, that was a huge fight. And then the view from Santa Monica. So the idea is really this project has multiple identities and hopefully creates this sort of singular, cohesive campus that, in a way, I think is a really new typology, not only for LGBT community, but also just as a kind of coexistence of housing and cultural program and social services in Los Angeles. So just, to kind of wrap up, we're really compelled by this idea of kind of social organizations that have yet to, or social technologies that have yet to find an architectural expression, and how we might be able to translate those into new typologies. That's it.